Hello, everyone. Let's continue on with Airframe by Michael Crichton. Casey laughed with her. No, that wouldn't be good at all. The people at the plant would be very upset. She finished tying the laces, swung her daughter's feet away. Now, where's your sweatshirt? I don't need it. Allison. Mom, it's not even cold. It may be cold later in the week. Get your sweatshirt, please. She heard a horn honk on the street outside. Saw Jim's black Lexus in front of the house. Jim was behind the wheel smoking a cigarette. He was wearing a jacket and tie. Perhaps he had a job interview, she thought. Allison stomped around her room, banging drawers. She came back looking unhappy, the sweatshirt hanging from the corner of her backpack. How come you're always so tense when Dad picks me up? Casey opened the door. Casey opened the door and they walked to the car in the hazy morning sunshine. Allison cried, Hi, Daddy, and broke into a run. Jim waved back with a boozy grin. Casey walked over to Jim's window. No smoking with Allison in the car, right? Jim stared at her sullenly. Good morning to you, too. His voice was raspy. He looked hungover, his face puffy and sallow. We had an agreement about smoking around our daughter, Jim. Do you see me smoking? I'm just saying. And you said it before, Catherine, he said. I've heard it 1,000,000 times, for Christ's sakes. Casey sighed. She was determined not to fight in front of Allison. The therapist had said that was the reason Allison had begun stuttering. The stuttering was better now, and Casey always made an effort not to argue with Jim, even though he didn't reciprocate. On the contrary, he seemed to take special pleasure in making every contact as difficult as possible. Okay, Casey said, forcing a smile. See you Sunday. Their arrangement was that Allison stay with her father 1 week a month, leaving Monday and returning the following Sunday. Sunday, Jim nodded curtly. Same as always. Sunday at 6. Oh, Christ. I'm just checking, Jim. No, you're not. You're controlling, the way you always do. Jim, she said, please, let's not. Fine with me, he snapped. She bent over. Bye, Ellie. Allison said, Bye, Mom. But her eyes were already distant, her voice cool. She had transferred her allegiance to her father, even before her seatbelt was fastened. Then Jim stepped on the gas, and Alexis drove away, leaving her standing there on the sidewalk. The car rounded the corner and was gone. Down at the end of the street, she saw the hunched figure of her neighbor Amos, taking his snarly dog for a morning walk. Like Casey, Amos worked at dye plant. She waved to him, and he waved back. Casey was turning to go back inside to dress for work when her eye caught a blue sedan parked across the street. There were 2 men inside. One was reading a newspaper. The other stared out the window. She paused. Her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, had been robbed recently. Who were these men? They weren't gangbangers. They were in their 20s with a clean cut, vaguely military appearance. Casey was thinking about taking down the license plate when her beeper went off. With an electronic squeal, she undipped it from her shorts and read. She sighed. 3 stars signaled an urgent message. John Martyr, who ran the factory, was calling an IRT meeting for 7 a.m. in the war room. That was a full hour before the regular morning call. Something was up. The final notation confirmed it, in a plant slang. BTOYA. Be there or it's your ass. Burbank Airport, 6:32 a.m. Rush hour traffic crept forward in the pale morning light. Casey twisted her rearview mirror and leaned over to check her makeup. With her short dark hair, she was appealing in a tomboyish sort of way. Long-limbed and athletic. She played first base on the plant softball team. Men were comfortable around her, They treated her like a kid sister, which served her well at the plant. In fact, Casey had few problems there. She had grown up in the suburbs of Detroit, the only daughter of an editor at the Detroit News. Her two older brothers were both engineers at Ford. Her mother died when she was an infant. So she had been raised in a household of men. She had never been what her father used to call a girly girl. After she graduated from Southern Illinois in journalism, Casey had followed her brothers to Ford. But she found writing press releases uninteresting, so she took advantage of the company's continuing education program to get an MBA from Wayne State. Along the way, she married Jim, a Ford engineer, and had a child. But Allison's arrival had ended the marriage. Confronted by diapers and feeding schedules, Jim started drinking, staying out late. Eventually, they separated. When Jim announced he was moving to the West Coast to work for Toyota, she decided to move out too. Casey wanted Allison to grow up seeing her father. She was tired of the politics at Ford and the bleak Detroit winters. California offered a fresh start. She imagined herself driving a convertible, living in a sunny house near the beach. With palm trees outside her window, she imagined her daughter growing up tanned and healthy. Instead, she lives in Glendale, an hour and a half inland from the beach. Casey had indeed bought a convertible, but she never put the top down. And although the section of Glendale where they lived was charming, gang territories began only a few blocks away. Sometimes at night, while her daughter slept, she heard the faint pop of gunfire. Casey worried about Allison's safety. She worried about her education, a school system where 50 languages were spoken. And she worried about the future because the California economy was still depressed, jobs scarce. Jim had been out of work for 2 years now, since Toyota fired him for drinking, and Casey had survived wave after wave of layoffs at Norton, where production had slumped thanks to the global recession. She had never imagined she would work for an aircraft company, but to her surprise, she had found that her plain-spoken, Midwestern pragmatism was perfectly suited to the culture of engineers that dominated the company. Jim considered her rigid and by the book, but her attention to detail had served her well at Norton, where she had for the last year been a vice president of quality assurance. She liked QA, even though the division had a nearly impossible mission. Norton Aircraft was divided into two great factions, production and engineering, which were perpetually at war. Quality assurance stood uneasily between the two. QA was involved in all aspects of production. The division signed off every step of fabrication and assembly. When a problem emerged, QA was expected to get to the bottom of it. That rarely endeared them to mechanics on the line or the engineers. At the same time, QA was expected to deal with customer support problems. Customers were often unhappy with decisions they themselves had made, blaming Norton if the galleys they had ordered were in the wrong place, or if there were too few toilets on the plane. It took patience and political skill to keep everybody happy and get the problems resolved. Casey, a born peacemaker, was especially good at this. In return for walking a political tightrope, workers in QA had to run off the plant. As a vice president, Casey was involved in every aspect of the company's work. She had a lot of freedom and wide-ranging responsibility. She knew her title was more impressive than the job she held. Norton Aircraft was awash in vice presidents. Her division alone had 4 VPs. The competition among them was fierce. But now, John Martyr had just promoted her to a liaison for the IRT. This was a position of considerable visibility, and it put her in line to head the division. Martyr didn't make such appointments casually. She knew he had a good reason for doing it. She turned her Mustang convertible off the Golden State Freeway onto Empire Avenue, Following the chain link fence that marked the south perimeter of Burbank Airport, she headed toward the commercial complexes, Rockwell, Lockheed, and Norton Aircraft. From a distance, she could see the rows of hangars, each with the Wing Norton logo painted above. Her car phone rang. Casey? It's Norma. You know about the meeting? Norma was her secretary. I'm on my way, she said. What's going on? Nobody knows anything, Norma said. But it must be bad. Martyr's been screaming at the engineering heads, and he's pushed up the IRT. John Martyr was the chief operating officer at Norton. Martyr had been program manager on the N-22, which meant he supervised the manufacture of that aircraft. He was a ruthless and occasionally reckless man, but he got results. Martyr was also married to Charlie Norton's only daughter. In recent years, he had a lot to say about sales. That made Martyr the second most powerful man in the company after the president. It was Martyr who had moved Casey up, and it was... Do with your assistant, Norma said. My what? Your new assistant. What do you want me to do with him? He's waiting in your office. You haven't forgotten. Oh, right. The truth was she had forgotten. Some nephew of the Norton family was working his way through the divisions. Martyr had assigned the kid to Casey, which meant she'd have to babysit him for the next 6 weeks. What's he like, Norma? Well, he's not drooling. Norma? He's better than the last one. That wasn't saying much. The last one had fallen out of a wing in major join and had nearly electrocuted himself in radio wreck. How much better? I'm looking at his resume, Norma said. Yale Law School and a year at GM. But he's been in marketing for the last 3 months, and he doesn't know anything about production. You're going to have to start him from the beginning. Right, Casey said, sighing. Martyr would expect her to bring him to the meeting. Have the kid meet me in front of the administration in 10 minutes, and make sure he doesn't get lost, okay? You want me to walk him down? Yeah, you better. Casey hung up and glanced at her watch. Traffic was moving slowly. Still 10 minutes to the plant. She drummed her fingers on the dashboard impatiently. What could the meeting be about? There might have been an accident or a crash. She turned on the radio to see if it was on the news. She got a talk station, a caller saying, Not fair to make kids wear uniforms to school. It's elitist and discriminatory. Casey pushed a button, changing the station, trying to force their personal morality on the rest of us. I don't believe a fetus is a human being. She pushed another button. These media attacks are all coming from people who don't like free speech. Where, she thought, is the news? Had an airplane crashed or not? She had a sudden image of her father, reading a big stack of newspapers from all over the country, every Sunday after church, muttering to himself, That's not the story. That's not the story. As he dropped the pages in an untidy heap around his living room chair. Of course, her father had been a print journalist back in the 1960s. It was a different world now. Now everything was on television. Television and a modest chatter on the radio. Up ahead, she saw the main gate of the Norton plant. She clicked the radio off. Norton Aircraft was one of the great names of American aviation. The company had been started by aviation pioneer Charlie Norton in 1935. During World War II, it made the legendary B-22 bomber, the P-27 Skycat fighter, and the C-12 transport for the Air Force. In recent years, Norton had weathered the hard times that had driven Lockheed out of the commercial transport business. Now it was one of the just 4 companies that still built large aircraft for the global market. The others were Boeing in Seattle, McDonnell Douglas in Long Beach, and a European consortium, Airbus, in Toulouse. She drove through acres of parking lots to Gate 7, pausing at the burial while security checked her badge. As always, she felt a lift driving into the plant. With its three-shift energy, the yellow tugs hauling bins of parts. It wasn't a factory so much as a small city, with its own hospital, newspaper, and police force. 60,000 people had worked here when she first came to the company. The recession had trimmed that to 30,000, but the plant was still huge, covering 16 square miles. Here they built the N-20, the narrow-body twin jet, the N-22, the wide-body, and a KC-22, the Air Force fuel tanker. She could see the principal assembly buildings, each more than a mile in length. She headed for the glass administration building. In the center of the plant, pulling into her parking space, she left the engine running. She saw a young man looking collegiate in a sport coat and tie, khaki slacks, and penny loafers. The kid waved diffidently as she got out of the car. Chapter 2. BLDG 64, 6:45 a.m. Bob Richmond, he said. I'm your new assistant. His handshake was polite, reserved. She couldn't remember which side of the Norton family he was from, but she recognized the type. Plenty of money, divorced parents, an indifferent record at good schools, and an unshakable sense of entitlement. Casey Singleton, she said. Get in. We're late. Late, Richmond said, as he climbed into the car. It's not even 7. First shift starts at 6, Casey said. Most of us in QA work the factory schedule. Don't they do that at the GM? I wouldn't know, he said. I wasn't legal. Spend any time on the floor? As little as possible. Casey sighed. It was going to be a long 6 weeks with the guy, she thought. You've been over in marketing so far. Yeah, a few months, he shrugged. But selling isn't really my thing. She drove south toward Building 64, the huge structure where the wide body was built. Casey said, By the way, what do you drive? A BMW, Richmond said. You might want to trade it in, she said, for an American car. Why? It's made here. It's assembled here, she said. It's not made here. The value's added overseas. The mechanics in the plant know the difference. They're all UAW. They don't like to see a Beamer in a parking lot. Richmond stared out the window. What are you saying? Something might happen to it? Guaranteed, she said. These guys don't screw around. I'll think about it, Richmond said. He suppressed a yawn. Jesus, it's early. What are we rushing to? The IRT. It's been pushed up to 7, she said. The incident review team. Every time something happens to one of our planes, the IRT meets to figure out what happened and what we should do about it. How often do you meet? Roughly every 2 months. That often, the kid said. You're going to have to start him from the beginning. Actually, Casey said, 2 months is pretty infrequent. We have 3,000 aircraft in revenue service around the world. With that many birds in the air, things happen, and we're serious about customer support. So every morning we hold a conference call with the service reps around the world. They report everything that caused a dispatch delay the day before. Most of it's minor stuff, a lab door jam, a cockpit light failed, but we track it in QA, do a trend analysis, and pass that on to product support. Uh-huh, he sounded bored. Then, Casey said, once in a while, we hit a problem that warrants an IRT. It has to be serious, something that affects flight safety. Apparently, we got one today. If Martyrs pushed the meeting up to 7, you can bet it's not a bird strike. Martyr? John Martyr was the program manager for the wide-body before he became chief operating officer, so it's probably an incident involving the N-22. She pulled over and parked in the shadow of Building 64. The gray hangar loomed above them, 8 stories high and nearly a mile long. The asphalt in front of the building was strewn with disposable earplugs, which the mechanics wore so they wouldn't go deaf from the rivet guns. They walked through the side doors and entered an interior corridor that ran around the perimeter of the building. The corridor was dotted with food dispensers, in clusters a quarter of a mile apart, Richmond said. We got time for a cup of coffee? She shook her head. Coffee's not allowed on the floor. No coffee, he groaned. Why not? It's made overseas? Coffee's corrosive. Aluminum doesn't like it. Casey led Richmond through another door onto the production floor. Jesus, Richmond said. The huge, partially assembled wide-body jets gleamed under halogen lights. 15 aircraft in various stages of construction were arranged in 2 long rows under the vaulted roof. Directly ahead of them, she saw mechanics installing cargo doors in the fuselage sections. The barrels of the fuselage were surrounded by scaffolding. Beyond the fuselage stood a forest of assembly jigs, immense tools, painted bright blue. Richmond walked under one of the jigs and looked up, open-mouthed. It was as wide as the house and 6 stories tall. Amazing, he said. He pointed upward at a broad flat surface. Is that the wing? The vertical stabilizer, Casey said. The what? It's the tail, Bob. That's the tail, Richmond said. Casey nodded. The wing is over there, she said, pointing across the floor. It's 200 feet long, almost as long as a football field. A klaxon sounded. One of the overhead cranes began to move. Richmond turned to look. This your first time on the floor? Yeah, Richmond was turning around, looking in all directions. Awesome, he said. They're big, Casey said. Why are they all lime green? We coat the structural elements with epoxy to prevent corrosion, and the aluminum skins are covered so they don't get dinged during assembly. The skins are highly polished and very expensive, so we leave that coating on until paint's shed. Sure doesn't look like GM, Richmond said, still turning and looking. That's right, Casey said. Compared to these aircrafts, cars are a joke. Richmond turned to her, surprised. A joke? Think about it, she said. A Pontiac has 5,000 parts, and you could build one in 2 shifts. 16 hours. That's nothing. But these things, she gestured to the aircraft looming high above them, are a completely different animal. The wide body has 1 million parts and a span time of 75 days. No other manufactured product in the world has the complexity of a commercial aircraft. Nothing even comes close, and nothing is built to be as durable. You take a Pontiac and run it all day, every day, and see what happens. It'll fall apart in a few months, but we design our jets to fly for 20 years of trouble-free service, and we build them to twice the service life. 40 years, Richmond said, incredulous. You built them to last 40 years. Casey nodded. We've still got lots of N5s in service around the world, and we stopped building them in 1946. We've got planes that have accumulated 4 times their design life, the equivalent of 80 years of service. Norton planes will do that. Douglas planes will do that. But no one else's birds will do that. You understand what I'm saying? Wow, Richmond said, swallowing. We call this the bird farm, Casey said. The planes are so big, it's hard to get a sense of the scale. She pointed to one aircraft to the right, where small clusters of people worked at various positions, with portable lights shining up on the metal. Doesn't look like many people, right? No, not many. There's probably 200 mechanics working on a plane, enough to run an entire automobile line. But this is just one position on our line, and we have 15 positions in all. There's 5,000 people in this building right now. The kid was shaking his head, amazed. It looks sort of empty. Unfortunately, Casey said, it is sort of empty. The wide-body line's running at 60% capacity, and 3 of those birds are whitetails. Whitetails? Planes we're building without customers. We build at a minimum rate to keep the line open, and we haven't got all the orders we want. The Pacific Rim's the growth sector, but with Japan in recession, that market's not placing orders, and everybody else is flying their planes longer, so business is very competitive this way. She started up a flight of metal stairs, walking quickly. Richmond followed her, footsteps clanging. They came to a landing, went up another flight. I'm telling you this, she said, so you'll understand the meeting we're going into. We build the hell out of these planes. People here are proud of what they do, and they don't like it when something's wrong. They arrived at a catwalk high above the assembly floor and walked toward a glass-walled room that seemed to be suspended from the roof. They came to the door. Casey opened it. And this, she said, is the war room. War room, 7:01 a.m. She saw it freshly through his eyes. A large conference room with grey outdoor carpeting and a round formica table, tubular metal chairs. The walls were covered with bulletin boards, maps, and engineering charts. The far wall was glass and overlooked the assembly line. 5 men in ties and shirt sleeves were there, a secretary with a notepad, and John Martyr wearing a blue suit. She was surprised he was here. The COO rarely chaired IRTs in person. Martyr was dark, intense, in his mid-40s, with slicked back hair. He looked like a cobra about to strike. Casey said, "This is my new assistant, Bob Richmond." Martyr stood up and said, "Bob, welcome," and shook the kid's hand. He gave a rare smile. Apparently Martyr, with his finely tuned sense of corporate politics, was ready to fawn over any Norton family member, even a nephew on loan. It made Casey wonder if this kid was more important than she thought he was. Martyr introduced Richmond to the others at the table. Doug Dorothy, in charge of structure and mechanical. He gestured to an overweight man of 45 with a pot-belly, bad complexion, and thick glasses. Dorothy lived in a state of perpetual gloom. He spoke in a mournful monotone, and could always be counted on to report that everything was bad and getting worse. Today, he wore a checked shirt and a striped tie. He must have gotten out of the house before his wife saw him. Dorothy gave Richmond a sad, thoughtful nod. Nguyen Van Trung, avionics. Trung was 30, trim and quiet, self-contained. Casey liked him. The Vietnamese were the hardest working people at the plant. The avionics guys were MIS specialists, involved with the aircraft computer programs. They represented the new wave at Norton, younger, better educated, better manners. Ken Byrne, power plant. Kenny was a red-haired and freckled, his chin thrust forward, ready to fight. Notoriously profane and abusive. He was known in the plant as Easy Burn because of his quick temper. We're going to end it there for this video, but I hope you join me again in the next video. Bye for now.